Welcome to Dad's Revenge, where quiet men prove that patience is a strength. Each story here is about a father who is underestimated, disrespected, or betrayed by the very people who should be protecting him, and how that father finds his own way to mend things. Welcome to today's story. At my town's Founders Day festival, beside the deed table my great-great-grandfather built with his own two hands, my son-in-law Pierce raised a signed contract worth $2,300,000 and told the whole crowd, "Grandpa already signed it away. He just doesn't remember." I am 69 years old, and in one sentence, people who had known me my entire life started deciding I was losing my mind. I said nothing. I only looked at that signature. I had never once written it. That night I opened a drawer I had not touched in years. So I drove to the county recorder's office before this town was even awake. That was how the day ended. It did not begin that way. That morning I was kneeling in the grass behind the community tent, unrolling a banner older than my own son-in-law, when Pierce found me and told me the folding tables were in the wrong place. Not asked, told. He said it the way he said most things to me, pleasant on the surface, already walking away before I could answer. I moved the tables. I always moved the tables. 40 years underground teaches a man that some fights are not worth the air they cost, and I had spent 3 years now deciding this particular fight belonged in that category. The Pruitt family has held this ridge for 6 generations. My great-great-grandfather cleared it with a mule and a debt he never fully paid off, and every man after him added something small, a fence line, a spring house, a name carved into the courthouse ledger. The county asked our family every year to set up the old deed table for the festival, the original survey under glass, our name stitched across the tablecloth in thread gone soft with age. This year, for the first time, Pierce had taken over the setup without asking me. He said it was easier that way. He said I should rest. I found my grandson Sonny sitting cross-legged under the table, a spiral notebook open on his knees, comparing 2 signatures, with the serious concentration only a 10-year-old can bring to a game that means nothing to anyone but him. "Grandpa," he said without looking up, "this one is fake. See how the letters lean different ways in the middle?" I knelt down beside him, slow, my knees announcing themselves the way they always did now, and looked at the page. He right. I had taught him that trick myself the year he turned 8, using my own signature and a clumsy copy I'd made with my left hand, just to prove a point. He had never forgotten it. Some things, once you show a child how to see them, they cannot stop seeing. The festival opened at noon, with the mayor at the microphone thanking the founding families of the county by name. He said the Pruitt land had shaped this valley for 100 years. He thanked Pierce Kemp for keeping that legacy alive. He did not say my name once. I stood near the back of the crowd with my hands folded, and I told myself it did not matter, the way I had been telling myself that for 3 years now, the way a man tells himself a slow leak in the roof can wait until spring. Sonny found my hand in the crowd and held it without being asked. He was tall for 10, all elbows and unlaced shoes, and he had his mother's way of noticing things nobody else caught. He did not ask me why the mayor forgot my name. He just held on a little tighter, and I let him, because some comfort does not need explaining to be understood by both people receiving it. Pierce's phone rang a few minutes before the ribbon cutting. I watched him step away from the crowd toward the parking area. His shoulders pulled up around his ears, the way they never were during a normal call. He was gone almost 10 minutes. When he came back, his face had the careful blankness of a man rearranging his expression before anyone could read what had been on it a moment earlier. He smiled at the first person who greeted him. The smile did not reach anywhere close to his eyes. I went to help him move a cooler of drinks from his truck bed to the refreshment table, the kind of small, useful thing I had done without thinking for 3 years in that house, in that family, on that land. The tailgate was down. Beside the cooler sat a thick manila envelope, unmarked except for a small printed logo in the corner, a mountain outline with the word Ridgeline stamped beneath it. Coal Company letterhead. I had seen enough of those letterheads in my working life to know one on sight the way another man might recognize a particular make of car. I did not think much of it in that moment. Pierce did business with half the companies in this county one way or another, and a man's truck bed is not usually where a stranger goes looking for meaning. I lifted the cooler, said something about the heat, and carried it to the table where Sonny was already waiting with 2 paper cups, one for each of us, because he had noticed I looked tired and decided on his own that lemonade might help. It was a small thing, that envelope. I want to be honest about that. In the moment, it was nothing more than a flash of color against gray truck bed carpet gone as soon as I looked away. I did not know yet that I would spend the rest of that year thinking about exactly what time I saw it, exactly what the logo looked like, exactly how careful I would need to become about remembering small things precisely. I only knew the way a man knows weather changing in his knees before the sky admits anything that something under the surface of that ordinary afternoon had already started to shift. The ribbon cutting came and went the way it always did. Scissors too big for the job. A photograph for the county paper. Polite applause. I had almost forgotten about the envelope in Pierce's truck by the time the afternoon program moved to the deed table, which was most years the quietest part of the day. Folks wandered by, looked at the old survey under its glass, asked a question or two about the original boundary lines, and moved along toward the funnel cake stand. I had done this part of the festival for 30 years running. I knew its rhythm the way I knew my own pulse. This year, the rhythm broke early. Pierce stepped up to the small platform beside the deed table, carrying a leather folder I had never seen before, the kind a man buys specifically because he has decided an occasion calls for it. He tapped the microphone once, twice, and the scattered crowd near the table began drifting closer, the way people do when they sense something is about to be said that they were not quite invited to hear, but cannot help wanting to. Folks, he said, I want to take a minute because this ridge has meant everything to my wife's family, and I think it's time this town understood just how much Calvin has done to protect it. I did not like the sound of my own name in his mouth just then. I could not have told you why not, in words, not standing there in the September heat with Sonny's lemonade sweating in my hand, but something in my chest went still and careful the way it used to go still and careful 80 feet underground when a beam creaked in a way it had no business creaking. Pierce opened the folder. He pulled out a single page, held it up so the afternoon sun caught the notary stamp in the corner. Gold foil flashing once across the crowd like a small, deliberate signal. This is a mineral rights agreement, he said, signed and notarized. It secures a $2,300,000 payment to this family, to be used to protect Calvin's retirement, and make sure nothing ever happens to this land the way it's happened to so many families around here who waited too long to plan ahead. A few people near the front made small, approving sounds, the kind you make when someone tells you a story with a happy ending built right into the framing of it. I heard the word smart pass between 2 women near the funnel cake line. I heard someone say, Pierce always did think ahead for that family. Briley was not there to hear any of it. She had picked up an extra shift at the hospital that morning, a nurse short on the floor, and no one else able to cover. And I remember thinking, in the small, distant way a man thinks things while the ground is shifting under him, that I was glad she was somewhere else. I did not yet understand how much that single stroke of ordinary bad luck would come to matter. I set my cup down on the corner of the deed table, careful, quiet the way I set down anything I might need my hands free for. Pierce, I said, what agreement? He looked at me then with an expression I want to describe honestly because it matters. It was not cruelty. It was something gentler and somehow worse, the practiced patience of a man addressing someone he has already decided cannot follow the conversation. He held the page a little higher, angled it so a woman near him could see the signature line at the bottom. Dad signed off on this back in the spring, he said, still using that same even, caring voice, the one built for delivering bad news at a hospital bedside. He turned to the crowd instead of to me. I know some of you have noticed Calvin's had a harder time keeping track of things lately. Dates, conversations. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It happens. The crowd near the table had gone quieter now, the particular quiet of people watching something they were not sure they should be watching, weighing whether to look away or lean in. Sonny's hand found mine again the way it had that morning, Except this time his grip was not comfort offered freely. It was a child holding on because he had felt the ground shift under an adult he trusted and did not yet have the words for what that meant. I looked at the signature on that page from 6 feet away, too far to read the details close enough to see the shape of it, the particular slant, the way the letters crowded together at the end, the way mine never did. 40 years of reading signatures for a living does something to a man's eye. It teaches him to see a lie in ink before his mind is finished catching up to what his eye already knows. "That's not," I started to say. I did not raise my voice. 30 years standing in school hallways during the worst moments of other people's lives had taught me that the loudest man in a room is rarely the one anyone remembers as right. So I kept my hands loose at my sides and I let my silence sit there in front of everyone for exactly as long as I could stand to let it sit. And I watched Pierce's eyes move from my face to the crowd and back again, checking the way a man checks a gauge he is not entirely sure he trusts. Pierce held up one hand, not unkindly, the gesture of a man asking for patience rather than silence. "Dad," he said, and something in the way he said it told me the next sentence had been rehearsed, practiced somewhere private, maybe in front of a mirror, maybe in the truck with the door shut and Ridgeline's envelope sitting on the seat beside him. "I don't want to embarrass you in front of everyone, I really don't. But I think it might be time we talked as a family about whether you should still be the one making decisions about this land alone." The words hung in the air for exactly as long as it takes a leaf to let go of a branch, which is longer than most people think if you have ever actually stood still enough to watch one do it. Somewhere near the funnel cake stand, a woman had stopped chewing. I noticed that before I noticed almost anything else. A small physical fact standing in for a large one, my mind was not yet ready to hold all at once. Pierce kept talking. His voice stayed gentle, reasonable, the voice of a man who has rehearsed sounding reasonable so many times that it no longer costs him anything to produce it. "I already spoke with an elder law attorney," he said, "just to understand our options. Nothing's decided. I only think, given everything, given the strain of the last few years, it might be time this family talked honestly about a guardianship, just to protect him, just to protect this land." A murmur moved through the crowd. Low, uneven, the sound 40 or 50 people make when they are trying to decide together without discussing it out loud, whether what they are hearing is generosity or something else wearing generosity's clothes. I watched a man I had known since grade school look at me with an expression I had never once had directed at me in 69 years. Pity, arriving early before the facts had bothered to catch up to it. Somewhere behind him, a teenage girl lifted her phone, thumb hovering over the screen, deciding whether this was the kind of moment worth keeping. A woman near the deed table reached for her husband's sleeve without looking away from me, the particular grip of someone bracing for a thing they have already decided will end badly. Then Pierce turned and he looked directly at me for the first time since he had started speaking, and something in his face settled into its final shape, the way wet concrete settles once you stop working it. "Grandpa already signed it away," he said loud enough for the whole crowd to carry it home in their own words. "By supper time, he just doesn't remember." I had spent 40 years underground and in county offices learning exactly one lesson better than any other, and it was this. The men who survive the worst moments of their working lives are not the ones who shout when the ceiling groans. They are the ones who go still and listen and decide with their whole clear mind what the next single action should be. Luella used to say I had a talent for going quiet at exactly the moment other men reached for their fists, and she never meant it as a compliment or an insult, only as a fact about me she had learned to plan around, the way you plan around weather. I went still now. I let my hands stay open at my sides. I did not raise my voice, and I did not lower it either, because I had nothing left to say that this crowd was prepared to hear as anything other than confirmation of exactly what Pierce had just handed them. Sonny's fingers tightened around mine until it almost hurt, and I understood distantly that he was the only person in that entire gathering who had not moved 1 inch closer to believing what he had just heard. I looked at my son-in-law for 3 full seconds. I want that recorded honestly, because everything after this moment will ask you to believe I acted rashly, and I did not. 3 seconds is a long time to look at a man in front of 40 people. I used every one of them. Then I turned and I walked. I did not walk fast. I did not walk toward my truck, or toward the road, or toward any destination a person watching might have named. I walked the way I have always walked away from things I could not fix in the moment I was standing in careful, unhurried me. My boots finding the gravel path between the deed table and the tree line by memory rather than sight. The festival noise did not stop behind me. Somewhere a band kept playing the same 3 chords it had been playing all afternoon. A child laughed high and bright, entirely unconnected to anything that had just happened 40 feet away from her. The air smelled like fried dough and cut grass, and underneath that, the particular mineral coolness that rises off ridge soil in late September once the sun starts losing its grip on the afternoon. Somewhere in the walk, without deciding to, I remembered Briley at 6 years old on this exact stretch of gravel, refusing to hold my hand, insisting she could cross the uneven ground on her own, falling twice and getting up twice without a single tear either time. I remembered thinking, watching her, that this was a child who would need very little protecting in her life, only room enough to do her own falling and her own standing back up. I did not know, walking this same gravel 40 years later, what to do with a daughter who had married a man capable of what I had just watched happen. I reached the shade of the old oak at the edge of the festival grounds, the one my grandfather used to say was older than the county itself, and I stood there with one hand flat against its bark, not because I needed to hold myself up, though perhaps I did, but because it was the only thing within reach that had been standing on this land longer than either Pierce or the trouble he had just planted in it. The house was empty by the time I got home. Pierce had stayed behind to manage what remained of the festival. The tables, the leftover lemonade, the particular business of smoothing over a crowd that has just watched something it was not supposed to see. And Sonny had gone with a neighbor family for supper, which was that evening the single mercy I was grateful for, without reservation. I did not want him in the house for what I was about to do. Some things a 10-year-old should learn about later, in his own time, in his own words. Not by watching his grandfather kneel on a bedroom floor at 9 o'clock at night. I went to the closet first. Beneath the floorboard my own father had cut loose 40 years ago, exactly wide enough for a hand and a small steel box I found. The lockbox where it had waited, patient, through 3 years of a life I had spent trying not to need it. I carried it to the bed and sat down with it in my lap, the way I used to sit with Briley when she was small and running a fever, careful, unhurried. The way you hold something that matters more than you are letting yourself feel just yet. The combination was Luella's birth month and year, for digits I could turn in the dark without looking. Inside on top sat the photograph I kept there instead of on the dresser, Luella at 58, in the porch chair she refused to let me replace, squinting into afternoon light with the particular expression she wore when she was pretending not to be pleased about something. I set it aside gentle and reached for what lay beneath it. The original survey was there, the one from 1891, brittle at the folds, 6 generations of Pruitt names running down the margin in 6 different hands. Beneath that sat the trust papers I had filed 4 years ago, quietly, without telling anyone but the attorney who drew them up, naming Sonny as the eventual owner of record for the mineral and timber rights beneath this ridge, structured so that no decision about selling any part of it could be made by anyone but him, and not until he turned 25. I had done that in the raw months after Luella's funeral, when grief had made me clear-eyed about exactly one thing, which was that land held loosely gets lost, and land held for a child gets protected by law in a way that promises alone never manage. Beneath the trust papers, folded twice, was Luella's letter. I had read it perhaps a dozen times since she wrote it, always alone, always at night. And I read it again now with the same care I always brought to it, the care of a man handling something he cannot replace. Most of it was ordinary, The kind of thing a wife writes a husband when she knows her time is measured and wants him to remember small daily things, where the extra key to the shed was kept, how she liked the porch swing angled toward the evening sun. The last lines were not ordinary. Calvin, she had written, promise me something. Whatever comes after me, don't you let this land slip through your hands, out of politeness. Politeness has cost this family more than any flood or any bank ever did. You fight for what's ours, quietly if you have to, but you fight. I sat with that line for longer than I meant to. My hand had gone still against the paper, and I let it stay still, and somewhere in that stillness I found myself thinking about my own father's brother, and a summer, decades gone, that I had never once discussed with Luella in the whole of our marriage. Not because it was a secret exactly, but because some rooms in a man's history stay shut simply because no one has needed to open them in a very long time. I did not open that room now either. I only felt its door cool under my hand and understood without needing the details spelled out in front of me that I had stood at this particular crossroads once before in my life, and I had chosen the quiet, easy road, and the quiet, easy road had cost more than I had ever told anyone it cost. I would not choose it again. I set the letter down, and I found the folder of my own signature samples, the ones I had kept for 30 years as part of my work verifying land transfers for the county. 3 examples on file notarized, dated, the kind of thing nobody thinks to ask for until the day they desperately need it. I laid them beside the survey and the trust papers, squared the edges the way I squared everything, and I sat there in the lamplight for a long moment, with all of it spread in front of me like a hand of cards a man plays only once in his life. I was not going to stay in this house tonight arguing with Pierce across a kitchen table while Sonny lay awake upstairs listening through the floor. I had done enough arguing across enough kitchen tables in my life to know exactly how those conversations end, with everyone more certain of their own position and no one 1 inch closer to the truth. I stood up slowly, my knees complaining the way they always did now, and I began deciding, item by item, what a man takes with him when he leaves a house he built half of, and what he leaves behind for the ones who will have to explain come morning exactly where he went. I took only what a man actually needs, which turns out to be less than most people imagine once you sit down and separate the things you use from the things you have simply grown accustomed to seeing in a room. 3 changes of clothes, my boots, the lockbox, the survey, the trust papers, Luella's letter, the signature samples, my father's fountain pen, black lacquer, worn pale along the barrel where 3 generations of Pruitt hands had gripped it the same way, taken from the drawer where it had sat since the morning of his funeral, when his own father had pressed it into my palm at the graveside and said almost nothing else that whole difficult day. A man's word is worth exactly what his signature is worth, he had told me once, years before that, and not 1 word more. I had carried that sentence around for 40 years without needing to write it down anywhere. I did not intend to start needing paper now. I left the second-hand recliner Pierce had once called an eyesore, the one I had reupholstered myself 2 winters back, rather than argue about it. I left my coffee mug with the chipped handle, the stack of paperbacks on my nightstand, the shirts still hanging in the closet with room enough for someone else's clothes to move in beside them eventually. None of it mattered enough to carry. I had learned that lesson slowly over 69 years old, the way a man learns which tools are worth the weight in his truck bed and which ones just take up room he could use for something that matters. In the kitchen, I found a photocopy of the original survey among the papers I had brought down, and I set it on top of the family Bible that had sat on the counter shelf since before Sonny was born, the one with 4 generations of birth dates written inside the front cover in 4 different sets of handwriting. I did not want to leave without saying anything at all. Silence, tonight of all nights, would read as exactly what Pierce wanted the town to believe about me. So I found a pen not my father's, an ordinary one, from the drawer by the phone, and I wrote 4 lines on a sheet of the notepad Briley kept for grocery lists. I did not sign anything I do not remember signing. This is the original survey of our land filed 1891. 6 generations of our name on it. I am staying with Dawson for now. Ask me before you believe anyone else's account of what happened today. I set the note beside the photocopy, squared both edges the way I squared everything, and I looked at that small stack of paper for a long moment under the kitchen light, understanding that it was likely the most important document I had ever left on a countertop, more important in its own quiet way than any deed or contract either Pierce or I would produce in the weeks ahead. I let myself out through the back door, the one that never quite latched right, easing it closed behind me with both hands so it would not announce my leaving to the whole sleeping street. The night had gone properly dark by then, the particular thick dark of a ridge town after the festival lights come down. No moon worth mentioning, just the porch light 2 houses over and the sound of my own boots on gravel. I had walked 10,000 times before, and would, I understood even then, likely never walk in quite the same way again. I thought of Sonny asleep 2 doors down at the neighbor's house, his shoes still untied even in sleep most likely. And I made myself a private promise standing there in the dark, that whatever else came of tonight, he would wake up tomorrow to a grandfather he could still find. Not a man who had simply vanished from his life, the way trouble sometimes vanishes people from a child's world, without explanation. I stood beside my truck for 1 moment before getting in, and I looked back once at the house, at the dark windows, at the shape of a roofline my own hands had helped repair more times than I could count. I did not let myself stand there long. Looking back at a thing does not make leaving it easier. It only makes the leaving slower. And I had never once in my life found that slowness bought a man anything worth having. The drive to Dawson's took 11 minutes on empty roads, past the county line, past the shuttered gas station that had been shuttered as long as I could remember, past the turnoff to the old mine entrance, sealed now behind a chain-link gate, rusted the color of dried blood. I did not turn on the radio. I drove with both hands on the wheel and my mind entirely, deliberately empty. The way I used to drive home after the worst shifts underground, when the only mercy available to a man was simply putting 1 mile behind him after another until his body remembered how to be tired instead of afraid. Dawson's porch light was on when I pulled in, which did not surprise me. Dawson Grant had never once in 38 years of friendship gone to bed before midnight, a habit he blamed on his knees, and I had always privately suspected had more to do with a man who preferred his own silence to whatever waited for him in sleep. He opened the door before I finished climbing the steps, already dressed despite the hour, and he looked at my face and then at the bag over my shoulder, and he did not ask a single question I was not ready to answer. "I need a place to stay, Dawson, just for a while." "Room at the end of the hall," he said. "Same as always." 3 days folded into each other at Dawson's the way days do when a man is waiting for something to happen that he cannot yet name. I kept the room at the end of the hall neat, bed made, square every morning, out of habit rather than necessity. My few belongings arranged on the dresser in the same order I had always kept them, because a man's habits are sometimes the only architecture he has left standing when the rest of his life has gone temporarily to pieces. Dawson ran his machine shop out front, same as he had for 30 years, the smell of cutting oil and hot metal drifting back through the hallway at all hours, a smell I had always found strangely comforting, the smell of work still being done, regardless of what else was happening in a man's private life. On the 3rd morning, I drove into town for coffee filters and a few groceries, small, ordinary errands, the kind of thing a man does to prove to himself that the world still contains ordinary errands. I stopped at the hardware store on Main Street, the one I had bought lumber and fittings from for 30-some years, and Ray behind the counter, a man who had once spent a full hour helping me track down a discontinued valve fitting without once mentioning he was closing for lunch, greeted me with a gentleness that had never once been part of our friendship before. He asked how I was doing, in a voice pitched the way you pitch your voice toward a child or an invalid, careful a half-step too soft, and he did not quite meet my eyes when he handed back my change. I understood, standing there with a bag of coffee filters in my hand, that something had already moved through this town ahead of me, the way water finds every low place in a valley before anyone thinks to build a wall against it. Later that same afternoon at the post office, the clerk who had weighed my packages for a decade asked after my health with the particular tilt of the head people reserve for asking about something they have already decided is fragile. I told her I was doing fine. Thank you for asking. And I watched her decide right there in front of the stamp counter not to believe me. I did not have to wait long to learn exactly what that something was. Dawson found me in the garage that evening, his phone in one hand, wiping the other on a shop rag, with more force than the rag required. "Bob," he said, which was the only thing he had ever called me since we met, using my middle name the way half this town did, out of a habit older than either of us could explain. "You need to see something." He turned the phone toward me. On the screen was a text thread, the Kemp and Pruitt family group chat, the one Briley had started years ago, mostly for birthday reminders and holiday logistics, a thread I was technically part of but rarely checked. Pierce had posted a message 2 days earlier, addressed to the wider circle of aunts and cousins and Luella's older brother out in Charleston, who checked his phone about once a week, whether it needed checking or not. "Wanted to give everyone an update on Dad," it read. "He's been having a harder time these past few years, more than most of you have probably noticed. And this week things got harder still. We're all hoping he gets some rest and comes back to himself soon. Please don't feel like you need to reach out right now. He's staying somewhere safe, and we're handling things as a family." I read it twice. The second time slower, the way I used to read a contract clause I suspected had been written to mean something other than what it appeared to say on first glance. Handling things as a family. Staying somewhere safe. Every phrase built for a listener who already wanted to believe the kindest possible version of an unkind story. And Pierce had always understood better than almost anyone I had ever known exactly which phrases a listener wanted to hear. Below the message sat 6 responses. "Sending love, thinking of you all, let us know if you need anything." Not one question asked, not one person writing back to ask what exactly had gotten harder, or where exactly somewhere safe was located, or whether anyone had thought to ask me directly how I understood my own week to have gone. Dawson watched my face while I read it, the rag still twisted between his hands. "Bob," he said quietly, "you've got 2 choices here as I see it. You can call every one of these people yourself and set them straight one by one, or you can let the paper you're already carrying do the talking when the time comes and save your breath for something that matters more." I set the phone down on the workbench, careful the way I set down everything I needed my hands free from. "Who's already decided to believe it?" I said. "That's what I want to know. Not who sent love in a group text. Who has actually decided in their own mind tonight that this is the true version of who I am?" Dawson did not answer that. I did not expect him to. It was not a question either of us could settle standing in a garage at 7 in the evening with the smell of cutting oil still hanging in the air, and some questions I had learned over 69 years only answer themselves slowly, one person's actual behavior at a time. Over a stretch of weeks, a man simply has to be patient enough to survive. Sonny came to see me on the 4th day, dropped off by Briley at the end of Dawson's gravel drive, in a car that idled there for exactly as long as it took him to climb out, then pulled away before he had even reached the garage door. I noted that. Briley had not come in herself, had not so much as rolled down her window to wave, and I could read it plainly enough without needing it explained. She was navigating something complicated in her own house that had nothing to do with whether she loved her father and everything to do with what she judged herself allowed to say out loud about it. Sonny ran the last stretch of gravel the way he always ran toward me. Full speed, backpack bouncing, and I braced myself the way I always did, and caught him anyway, my knees registering the impact with the particular ache of a man who was glad to feel something that reminds him he is still standing upright in the world. "You're taller," I told him, which was true every single time I said it, and which always made him stand a half-inch straighter for having heard it. Dawson had left a tin of hot cocoa on the shelf above the coffee maker specifically, I suspected, in anticipation of exactly this visit, and Sonny and I sat at the small table in the back room with 2 mugs between us while he told me about his week in the unbroken, associative way children tell you about their weeks. A science project about erosion, an argument with his friend Caleb over whose turn it was to feed the class hamster, a bird he had found in the yard and buried beneath the oak tree with what he described with complete seriousness as a proper ceremony. I listened to all of it the way I had always listened to Sonny, with my whole attention, because a child who is genuinely listened to grows into a person who trusts his own observations. And that trust, once built, does not come apart easily later in life. His shoelaces were untied again, both of them, the way they always were, no matter how many times I had shown him the trick of double knotting. And I decided, watching him swing his feet under the table, that some lessons simply take longer to land than others, and a man does well to keep teaching them anyway, without expecting quick results. We had been talking for perhaps 20 minutes when his voice changed, dropped into something more careful, the register children use when they have been carrying a piece of information and have finally decided the moment has arrived to set it down. "Grandpa, I have to tell you something," he said, "and I don't know if I should, but I think you'd want to know." I kept my hands loose around my mug. "Okay," I said. "I'm listening." "Mom went into your old room," he said. "She was in there a long time, like 2 hours. She had a box and she found a folder of papers, old letters from that lawyer you used to talk to, the one about the land stuff, and she read all of them, and then she called somebody, and she was on the phone for a really long time, and she kept saying a number." My chest went carefully, deliberately still. The same stillness I had learned 80 feet underground. The stillness a man practices until it becomes involuntary. "What kind of number?" I asked, keeping my voice easy, curious, the voice of a grandfather asking about nothing in particular. Sonny's forehead creased with the effort of getting the details right. "A big number," he said. "Like, really big." And then she said your name, and then she said, he screwed up his face concentrating, he never told us the trust was that large. And then she went into her room and shut the door. I set my mug down very carefully on the table, both hands the way you set down something you do not entirely trust yourself to be holding. "Grandpa, do you have a lot of money?" Sonny asked, his eyes wide with the particular gravity of a 10-year-old asking a question he already suspects is too large for a simple answer. "I have enough, buddy," I said, which was true, and which was also not the answer to the question he had actually asked. I sat with that information after he had moved on to describing the erosion project in more detail than any adult strictly required. It settled into my chest like a level finding true. The situation in that house had already shifted into something larger than my own reputation. If Briley had found correspondence detailing the scope of the trust of she and Pierce, now grasped exactly how much stood between Sonny and nothing, then the danger was no longer only that people believed I was confused. The danger was that a document I had built specifically to be untouchable might already be under quiet examination by people looking for a way to touch it. I had planned until that moment to wait, to let the town's opinion of me settle on its own, to let the truth surface at its own patient pace, the way truth generally does, if a man is willing to be still long enough. I no longer had that luxury. Waiting protected my pride. It did nothing to protect Sonny, and Sonny had never once in this entire situation done anything except love 2 people who were currently failing to deserve it in equal measure. I would call the attorney in the morning. Not to defend myself, to make certain that whatever else came apart in this family, the one thing built to outlast all of it stayed exactly as unreachable as I had built it to be. Sonny let the silence sit for a moment after I set my mug down, the particular patient silence of a child who has learned that adults sometimes need a beat or two before they are ready to keep talking. Then he reached for another cracker from the sleeve Dawson had set out, chewed it thoughtfully, and added in the same careful voice as though the 2 pieces of news belonged in the same breath because they had arrived in his own mind that way. "There's something else," he said, "about the truck." "Which truck?" I asked. "The old blue one, in the shed by the equipment barn." Sonny's brow furrowed with the effort of getting the sequence right. "Dad went out there last week looking for the tire jack, and he came back holding a folder, and he said, Sonny dropped his voice into an approximation of his father's. "Look what Grandpa left lying around out here." And he took it inside and made a copy of something on the printer. I kept my face level, the way I had trained it to stay level through 30 years of school board meetings and county inspections, the muscles around my eyes doing the work of appearing merely interested, rather than doing whatever they actually wanted to do underneath that surface. "Do you know what was in the folder?" I asked. "Papers," Sonny said, unhelpfully specific, in the way of a 10-year-old who had been more interested in the tire jack conversation than the folder itself. He showed it to a man who came by the house on Thursday. A man in a county truck with a clipboard. Dad said it proved you'd already agreed to the coal thing a long time ago, before he squinted trying to recall the exact word before things got confusing for you. He did not remember the man's name, only that the truck had a green stripe down the side, and the man had worn a tie despite the heat, which struck me as exactly the kind of visit a person could arrange quietly if they knew who to call. I did not answer right away. I sat with the information the way I used to sit with a suspect crack in a mine timber, turning it slowly, checking it from every angle before deciding whether it was load-bearing or cosmetic. The old blue truck had sat in that equipment shed for 6 years since the transmission finally gave out on it for good, and replacing it stopped making financial sense against buying something newer for the fieldwork. I had gone out to that shed at least once a month for as long as I had lived on that land, checking the battery, running the wipers, keeping the mice from nesting in the cab upholstery the way mice will nest in anything left still long enough. I knew every inch of that truck's interior the way I knew the inside of my own boots. There had never been a folder in that glove box. There had never been anything in that glove box except the registration, an expired insurance card, and a half-empty tin of peppermints that had probably gone stale sometime during the previous administration. Which meant, and I turned this over slowly, deliberately, the way you turn a bolt you suspect has been cross-threaded, that whatever Pierce had found in that truck had not been sitting there waiting to be found. It had been placed there, recently, by someone who understood that an old, forgotten vehicle on an isolated property makes an excellent hiding place for exactly the kind of thing a man wants discovered later, under circumstances that make the discovery look accidental rather than arranged. I thought about the notarized page Pierce had held up at the festival, the gold foil catching light across the crowd. I thought about the signature I had looked at from 6 feet away and known immediately, in the particular wordless way a lifetime of reading signatures teaches a man to know such things, was not mine. 2 documents now, 2 separate forgeries apparently appearing at 2 separate moments, each one calibrated to land exactly when it would do the most damage to exactly the audience most inclined to believe it. A man does not accidentally produce 2 forged contracts 3 weeks apart. A man plans that. A man sits somewhere quiet with a pen and a photocopy of an old signature and practices the way any craftsman practices a skill he intends to use more than once. Grandpa Sonny said, watching my face with the same unsettling attentiveness he brought to everything, "Are you okay? Your face looks like it does when you're fixing something that's more broken than you thought." "That's exactly right, buddy," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to, which cost me more effort than he would ever know. "It's more broken than I thought, but I'm going to figure out exactly how and exactly who, and I'm not going to stop until I do." Sonny nodded, satisfied with that answer, in the particular way children are satisfied by adults who tell them the truth, even when the truth is not entirely comfortable. And he reached for another cracker, and I sat there turning the shape of 2 forged signatures over in my mind, understanding for the first time that this was not a single lie I was dealing with. It was a system, and systems, in my long experience with them, always have exactly one weak point where they were built too fast to hide the seams. Dawson drove Sonny back to the end of the road himself that evening, since Briley had asked him over the phone to handle the pickup rather than come herself again. And when he returned, he found me still sitting at the small table, the cocoa gone cold in both mugs, the cracker sleeve empty. He did not ask what had happened. He simply pulled out the chair across from me and waited, the way he always waited, until I was ready to hand him the shape of it in my own time. 2 forged signatures, I told him finally, 3 weeks apart. Somebody's been busy. Dawson's jaw worked, once the closest he ever came to visible anger. "You need a lawyer, Bob," he said. "Not next week, tomorrow morning, first thing." "I already decided that," I said. "I just needed to hear somebody else say it out loud to know I wasn't only telling myself what I wanted to be true." Christopher Guerrero's office sat on the second floor of a brick building on the county courthouse square, above a shoe repair shop that had been there longer than either of us had been alive, and I climbed the outside stairs at 8:15 the next morning with a folder under my arm containing everything I had gathered: the survey, the trust papers, the signature samples, Luella's letter left deliberately at the bottom, where no attorney needed to read it to do his job. I had never hired a lawyer in my life. 69 years, and every dispute I had ever settled, I had settled with a handshake, a fair price, or on the rare occasion, neither worked, simple patience outlasting whoever I disagreed with. Sitting in Christopher's small waiting room, a single potted fern and a coffee maker that had clearly seen better decades, I sat straighter than I needed to, the way a man sits when he has stepped into territory that operates by different rules than any he has used before. I was glad in that particular moment that the man behind the door had a reputation in this county for being exactly the kind of person who did not waste a client's time explaining rules he had no intention of bending. Guerrero came out to collect me himself, rather than sending an assistant, which told me something before he had said a single word. "Mr. Pruitt," he said, extending a hand, "come on back. Let's hear what's happening." His office was smaller than I expected, tidy 2 walls of law books arranged by subject rather than color, a single legal pad on the desk, and nothing else that did not serve a direct purpose. He gestured me into the chair across from him and settled into his own with the unhurried attention of a man who had already decided this conversation deserved his full focus rather than a portion of it split with his phone. I told him everything in order, without embellishing and without softening any part of it, because 30 years describing safety violations to school boards and county commissions had taught me that a problem described accurately gets solved faster than a problem described emotionally. The festival, the contract with the notary stamp, the guardianship suggestion delivered in front of 40 people, the second contract discovered in a truck I had checked monthly for 6 years, produced conveniently for a county visitor whose name nobody in my family could quite remember. The trust papers filed 4 years earlier and Briley's discovery of the correspondence describing them. Guerrero wrote through most of it in a small, precise hand, the kind of handwriting a man develops when he has spent decades taking notes he needs to be able to trust later. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he set his pen down and looked at me directly. "You brought the documents," he said. Not a question. I opened the folder and laid them out one at a time, the survey first, then the trust papers, then the 3 notarized signature samples I had kept on file with the county for 30 years as part of my own land assessment work. He examined each one with the unhurried thoroughness of a man sorting evidence rather than simply reading paperwork, and when he reached the signature samples, he held them a long moment under his desk lamp. "These are notarized comparison signatures," he said, "on file with the county recorder independently of anything your son-in-law has produced." "That's correct," I said. "I filed 3 separate samples over the years as part of my assessor work. Any document bearing my signature can be compared against these directly." Guerrero leaned back slightly, and something in his expression shifted. Not much, but enough for me to read it as the particular satisfaction of an attorney who has just realized a case is stronger than he initially assumed it might be. "Mr. Pruitt," he said, "what you're describing isn't simply a family disagreement about competency. If these signatures don't match your verified samples, you're describing forgery, and forgery of a land transaction document is a criminal matter, not only a civil one." "What can we do about it?" I asked. "Today, not eventually." "2 things," he said, capping his pen. "First, I file a formal challenge with the county recorder, disputing the validity of both signed instruments, which prevents either document from being used to transfer, sell, or encumber the property until the dispute is resolved. That I can have filed by the end of the week. Second, I request an independent handwriting comparison through the county's own retained examiner using your notarized samples as the baseline. If the comparison confirms what you already believe, we have grounds to pursue this as fraud, and your son-in-law will need considerably more than a friendly voice to explain his way out of it."
I sat with that for a moment, feeling something in my chest loosen slightly for the first time since the festival. Not relief exactly. Relief would come later, if it came at all, but something adjacent to it. The particular ease of a man who has finally handed a problem to someone equipped to actually solve it, rather than simply endure it.
"Do it," I said. "All of it. And Mr. Guerrero, thank you for taking me seriously this morning. I understand I don't look to most people lately like a man worth taking seriously." Guerrero looked at me steadily across the desk. "Mr. Pruitt," he said, "I've been practicing law in this county for 18 years. I have met a great many people who came to me confused. You are not one of them." That much was obvious within the first 2 minutes. Pierce came to Dawson's on a Tuesday afternoon, 4 days after Guerrero filed the challenge with the county recorder, which told me he already knew by then that his window for a quiet resolution had narrowed considerably. I heard his truck before I saw it, the particular idol of an engine that costs more than it needs to, and I set down the socket wrench I had been using to help Dawson with a customer's transmission and walked out to the gravel lot to meet him, rather than let him come find me inside. He had the same leather folder with him. I noticed that immediately, the specific detail arriving before any larger thought had the chance to catch up to it. The same folder from the festival, and something in my chest recognized it the way a man recognizes a tool he has watched cause damage once already. "Dad," he said, and the word came out careful, rehearsed, the opening line of a conversation he had clearly practiced more than once in his truck on the drive over. "I want to talk. Just the two of us. No crowd this time." I did not invite him inside. We stood in the gravel lot instead, the afternoon sun flat and unforgiving, and he opened the folder and drew out a single document, several pages stapled together, and held it toward me, the way a man hands over something he hopes will be received without much scrutiny. "This is a settlement agreement," he said. "Briley and I want to put all of this behind us. It formally documents that there's no ongoing dispute over the property, no claim against the trust, nothing hanging over the family anymore. It lets everyone move forward." I took the pages. I read them the way I read every document that has ever mattered to me, slowly, completely, twice, because I learned decades ago that the sentences that cost a man the most are always the ones he only skimmed. It was thorough. Whoever had drafted it, and I doubt it very much it had been Pierce alone, had built-in language waiving not only any challenge to the mineral rights contracts, but any future claim on the trust itself, any right to contest guardianship proceedings should they be filed later, any standing whatsoever to involve myself in decisions about the land going forward. Buried in the 4th page in the particular small print a man is meant to skim past was a clause releasing Pierce and Briley from any obligation to account for how proceeds from a future mineral sale might be spent, a detail that told me more about the real purpose of the document than anything Pierce had said aloud. "Pierce," I said, "who wrote this?" "A colleague of Briley's from the hospital administration office. He handles some estate matters on the side. It's standard language, Dad. It just lets everyone stop fighting." "This isn't standard language," I said. "This is you asking me to sign away my legal right to challenge 2 forged documents and give up any future protection for Sonny's trust dressed up as peacemaking." Pierce's jaw tightened. The particular tightening I remembered from when he was young enough that I still called him by a nickname nobody used anymore. "Dad, think about what you're doing. You're living above a machine shop. You've hired a lawyer. This whole thing has gone so far past what it needed to. I have spent 3 years in this family choosing quiet over correct," I said, and the words settled into their true shape only as I spoke them, a shape I had been circling for weeks without landing on directly, until that exact moment. I did it because I believed keeping the peace mattered more than being right. I was wrong about that. Being right and keeping the peace are not opposites, Pierce. They only look that way to people who have never actually tried holding on to both at once. He stared at me for a long moment, something moving behind his eyes that I could not fully name, and then he reached for the folder. I held it a beat longer than necessary before releasing it, my own small refusal to make this easy for him. "I'm not signing this," I said, Take it back to whoever drafted it."
He said nothing further. He turned and walked to his truck, and I watched him go, and I did not follow because there was nothing left in that conversation that needed my presence to finish playing out.
His truck door was still open when his phone rang, and the gravel lot carried sound the way empty spaces do in the late afternoon quiet, further than a man expects. I was not trying to listen. I want that understood plainly, but his voice reached me anyway, tight, low, urgent, in a way I had not heard from him even at the festival. "He won't sign," Pierce said into the phone, one boot still on the running board, his back half turned toward me. I know, we need it done before the anniversary. There isn't any more room to wait on this." Then the door shut and the engine turned over, and he pulled out of Dawson's lot without looking back once. And I stood there in the gravel with the sound of that sentence still moving through me, turning it over the way I turned over every unfamiliar bolt before deciding how hard to force it. Before the anniversary. Whose anniversary? And what exactly needed to be done before it arrived? I stayed out in that lot a long while after the dust from his tires had settled, running through every anniversary I could think of that touched this family, or this county even loosely. A birthday, a wedding date, the festival itself. None of them landing with the particular weight his voice had carried. Whatever it was, it had a deadline attached to it, and a man does not sound that urgent about a deadline unless missing it costs him something he cannot afford to lose. Margot Harvey knocked on the garage door one Sunday afternoon, carrying a covered casserole dish with both hands, her expression full of such uncomplicated concern that my throat tightened before she said a word. Margot had taught 4th grade at the elementary school for 28 years before retiring to run the church's outreach committee, and in the small economy of this county where reputations get built one quiet act at a time rather than announced, she had become the closest thing this town had to an unofficial record keeper of who a person truly was. "Calvin Pruitt," she said in the particular tone people use when they are relieved to find the face still attached to a name they have been worrying over. "You look thinner." "I'm fine, Margot," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. "You are not fine," she said pleasantly, and walked past me into the back room without waiting for an invitation. Set the casserole down on the small table and turned around with her hands on her hips. "We heard what happened. Not all of it, and not from you, which is how I know the version currently making the rounds is only half true at best. I want you to know that Ray at the hardware store and I have both told the same thing to anyone who repeated that nonsense about you being confused." Her eyes carried the particular bright anger of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize a lie the moment she heard one. 30 years, Calvin," she said. "I have known you 30 years. You caught the cracked support beam under Dolores Ashby's back porch before it collapsed under her grandchildren free of charge on a Saturday you could have spent doing anything else. You spent 4 afternoons teaching Frank Duca's apprentice how to read a survey map when the boy was one bad week from quitting the trade entirely. A man like that does not forge his own signature and then forget he did it." My chest ached sharply enough that I had to lean back against the workbench to keep steady. I had not cried since the morning of Luella's funeral, and I did not intend to start now. But something about Margot Harvey standing in Dawson's back room, holding a casserole dish, and saying 30 years in that particular voice made the backs of my eyes burn in a way I had to work at controlling. I appreciate that I managed. "Sit down," she said. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it." I sat. She sat across from me, folding her hands on the table the way I imagined she had once folded them at a classroom desk, patient, organized, prepared to be useful whether or not the person across from her felt ready to receive it. "There's a fund," she said. "Nothing dramatic, just people in this county who wanted to do something. A few of the teachers from the elementary school, some of the families whose kids you kept an eye on over the years without ever making a production of it. Frank Duca himself, who says you taught his apprentice to read a map when the boy needed it most, and never once mentioned the favor again afterward." She reached into her coat pocket and set a plain white envelope on the table between us. "It is not charity, Calvin," she said. "Do not you dare call it charity. It is what neighbors do for each other in a county that still remembers how." I looked at the envelope the way a man looks at something making him feel things he is not entirely prepared to feel in front of another person. "Margot," I said carefully, "I have savings. I am not in need of—" "I know you are not destitute," she said briskly. "That is not the point, and you know it. The point is that dozens of people in this county wanted you to know they see you clearly. That whatever story is currently circulating in that house does not match the man this county has actually known for 3 decades. Will you please just take the envelope?" My hands were not entirely steady when I finally picked it up. I set it down again in front of me, pressed my palms flat on either side of it, and took a slow breath. Her expression softened into something that reminded me painfully and without warning of Luella. Not because the two women resembled each other in any physical sense, but because they shared the particular quality of women who have lived honestly and at length and have long since stopped requiring the world to be anything other than exactly what it is. Margot reached across the table and covered my hands with both of hers, squeezing once firmly the way a person holds on to something they intend to keep holding. "You are going to be all right," she said. It was not a question. I know I said, and for the first time since the night I had sat on the edge of a strange bed, listening to my own absence explained away in a family group text, I actually believed it. Margot left an hour later, but she was not the only visitor that Sunday. A young man named Blake, who worked out of Frank Duca's shop and whom I had once spent 4 Saturdays teaching to read elevation lines on a survey map, stopped by just before dusk. Grease still under his fingernails, despite an obvious attempt to scrub it away before knocking. He did not stay long. He told me he had heard what people were saying and that he wanted me to know he had not forgotten those 4 Saturdays and that a man who teaches a stranger's apprentice for nothing does not turn into a liar overnight. I shook his hand. My throat was too full to manage more than 2 words in return. "Thank you, Blake." That evening, once the garage had gone quiet, I sat alone with the white envelope still unopened in front of me, thinking about how a reputation built slowly over 30 years out of small, unremarkable kindnesses had turned out sturdier than any single afternoon at a festival could tear down. Pierce had needed one carefully staged scene to make a room full of strangers doubt me. This county had needed 30 years of ordinary Tuesdays to decide on its own that the doubt did not fit the man they actually knew. Sonny arrived for his next visit with his spiral signature notebook tucked under one arm, the way other children might carry a favorite toy. And I had learned by now not to be surprised by the particular seriousness with which he treated that small collection of names and marks he had gathered from everyone he trusted enough to ask. We sat at the small table with Coco again, a ritual that had settled into itself over these past weeks, the way rituals do, comfortable, unhurried, built entirely around the fact that he never needed to be asked twice to talk. He told me about a science fair project on rock erosion that had earned him a blue ribbon and made me promise to come see the display board before the school took it down. He told me about a disagreement between 2 boys at recess that he had attempted to mediate using what he described with complete seriousness as reasonable points on both sides, a phrase I suspected he had picked up from Briley and now deployed with the confidence of a boy who believed it explained most disputes in the adult world as well. He told me about a dead leaf he had pressed between 2 library books because it was, in his exact words, a really good color, and asked whether I thought pressed leaves counted as a science experiment or just a hobby, a question I answered as seriously as it deserved. I listened to all of it with my whole attention, the way I always did, because that attention was the one thing in this entire ordeal I still had complete control over giving him. We had been sitting there perhaps 40 minutes when he set down his mug and looked at the table instead of at me, his voice dropping into the more careful register he used when he had been carrying something and had finally decided the moment had arrived to set it down. "Grandpa, I need to tell you something," he said. "I remembered something, and I think I was supposed to tell somebody, but I didn't know who." I kept my hands loose around my own mug. "Okay," I said. "I'm listening." He looked up at me, then his eyes very serious, the dark, focused brown of a boy who understood that what he was about to say mattered, even if he could not fully explain why it mattered. "The night before the festival," he said, "I woke up because I needed water. It was late past midnight because the house was totally quiet and Mom's light was already off." "Okay," I said again, same tone, the same careful, unhurried easiness. "I came downstairs to get a glass, and the kitchen light was on," Sonny said, and he wrapped both hands around his mug as though steadying himself for what came next. "Dad was at the table. He had this piece of paper in front of him, and he was writing on another piece of paper next to it, over and over the same thing, like practicing his handwriting for school." My chest went entirely deliberately still. "What was he writing?" I asked, and I heard my own voice come out level, careful, the particular levelness that had cost me 30 years of practice standing in front of angry parents and frightened school boards. "I don't know exactly," Sonny said, his forehead creasing with the effort of precision. "But the paper he was copying from looked old, like really old, and folded up with lines on it like a map. And he kept doing the same little squiggle at the bottom, over and over like 20 times, like he wasn't happy with how it looked. His shoulders were all hunched over it like when I'm trying to get my letters to stay on the lines, and they won't. And there was a little trash can next to him with a bunch of balled-up papers in it, more than I've ever seen him throw away at once." "Did he see you?" I asked. Sonny shook his head. "I only watched from the stairs for a minute. Then I got scared he'd be mad I was up, so I went back to bed without the water." He looked at me with an expression equal parts uncertain and determined, the look of a boy who has decided the truth matters more than his own comfort in delivering it. "Grandpa," he said, "was that your signature Dad was practicing?" The kitchen at Dawson's went very quiet around us. The particular quiet that follows a sound loud enough to still every smaller sound in the room. Except no sound had actually been made, only a 9-word question from a 10-year-old boy holding a mug of cocoa gone lukewarm in his hands. 40 years of reading signatures for a living does something to a man's understanding of what a piece of paper can prove. I had looked at that notarized contract from 6 feet away at the festival and known in the wordless, immediate way of a man reading a language he has spoken his whole life that the hand behind it was not mine. I had suspected the folder, the timing of it all. Suspicion, though, is a different animal entirely from a 10-year-old boy describing in precise and uninvited detail his own father hunched over a kitchen table at midnight practicing another man's name. I set my mug down on the table, both hands careful the way I set down anything I needed my hands entirely free from. My right hand found the fountain pen in my shirt pocket without my telling it to closed around the barrel and held on. I did not answer him right away. There are questions a man needs a moment of complete stillness to receive fully before he can trust his own voice to respond to them honestly. And this was one of those questions. The kind that arrives quietly from an unexpected direction and rearranges in the space of 9 words everything a person believed they already understood about the shape of the harm being done to them. I did not sleep well that night. And I do not say that lightly, since I have never in my life been a man troubled by sleep, not through Luella's illness, not through the hardest stretches underground, not even in the days right after the festival. But Sonny's 9 words sat with me in the dark at Dawson's until well past 2 in the morning, and somewhere around 3 I stopped trying to close my eyes against them and simply let myself lie there thinking clearly instead, which had always, in my experience, been the more productive use of a sleepless night, regardless. I lay on my back with both hands folded on my chest, the fountain pen still in my shirt pocket where it had stayed since the afternoon before, and I ran through, one by one, every version of Pierce I had known across 15 years of family gatherings, searching for the moment if there had ever truly been one single moment where the man I thought I understood had started becoming someone capable of practicing another man's handwriting at a kitchen table past midnight. By morning I had a plan, and a plan for a man built the way I am built has always been worth more than a night of rest. Guerrero had told me he would request an independent handwriting comparison through the county's retained examiner, using my notarized samples as the baseline. And that process, he had warned me, moves at the pace institutions generally move, which is to say, slower than any of us would prefer. I did not intend to sit idle waiting for that pace to catch up to what I already knew in my bones to be true. I had spent 30 years working alongside the county recorder's office in my own capacity as an assessor, and I still knew better than most private citizens ever would exactly which door in that building led to the archive room where 3 decades of notarized samples sat waiting, mine included, for someone with the proper standing to request a look at them. Leland Heath had run that archive for as long as I could remember, a careful, unhurried man in his early 50s who treated the county's paper records with the particular reverence some men reserve for scripture filing cabinets arranged not merely alphabetically, but by some private secondary logic only he had ever fully mapped, and a coffee mug on his desk that read, "World's Okayest Archivist," a joke gift from a niece some years back that he had never once, to my knowledge, found reason to retire. I found him at his desk that morning, surrounded by the specific orderly clutter of a person who knows exactly where everything is, despite what a stranger might assume from looking at it. "Calvin," he said, looking up over his reading glasses. "Been a while." "It has," I said. "I need a favor, Leland, and I think, given everything, you're owed the full explanation before I ask for it." I told him what I had told Guerrero, condensed, accurate, without the parts that belonged only to my own private grief, rather than to the facts of the case. Leland listened the way men who spend their careers around official records tend to listen. Patient, unhurried, occasionally asking a precise, clarifying question rather than an emotional one, which I appreciated more than I said aloud. "2 forged instruments," he said, finally removing his glasses and cleaning them on his shirt tail, a habit I remembered from every conversation I had ever had with him. "And you've got 3 notarized comparison samples on file from your assessor work." "That's right," I said. Leland was quiet for a moment, turning something over behind his eyes, the way a careful man does before committing himself to a course of action. "I'm not supposed to run this comparison informally," he said. "Guerrero's request will come through the proper channel eventually, and when it does, I'll do it exactly as I'm required to." But he stood, moving toward the archive shelves, with the particular decisiveness of a man who has just decided a rule and a wrong sitting side by side deserve to have the wrong addressed first. "There's nothing stopping me from pulling your own samples now, today, and taking a preliminary look myself, informally. So at least you're not sitting around not knowing while the official machinery grinds along at its own pace." "I would be grateful for that," I said, and I meant it more plainly than the words themselves managed to carry. "I'll call Guerrero's office myself once we've had a look," Leland said, already moving so nobody downtown mistakes this for anything other than what it is. One careful man doing another careful man a decent turn while the paperwork catches up to reality. "Everything proper stays proper. I just don't see the sense in you sitting home another week not knowing." He returned a few minutes later with a thin folder, my name printed across the tab, in the same careful government hand every folder in that archive carried, and set it on the examination table beneath the large magnifying lamp bolted to the corner workstation, the one I remembered him using years ago to settle a boundary dispute between 2 neighboring farms that had nearly come to blows over 4 contested feet of fence line. He pulled a second folder from his bag, the copies Guerrero's office had already forwarded of both disputed contracts, and laid them side by side with my 3 notarized samples, squaring every edge the way I squared everything myself, a small habit I had never noticed in another man before that exact moment. "Let's see what we're actually looking at," he said, and pulled the lamp down closer, adjusting the angle twice before he seemed satisfied with the light and reached for the first of my 3 notarized samples with the particular careful precision of a man about to compare 2 things that a great deal now depended on matching or not matching exactly. Leland worked in silence for a long while longer than I expected, moving the lamp incrementally, turning each document a few degrees at a time, holding a loupe to his eye and murmuring measurements to himself that meant nothing to me, and I suspected everything to him. I had watched enough careful men do enough careful work in my life to know better than to interrupt one mid-examination, so I sat across the table with my hands folded and let him take exactly as long as the work required. "Baseline is wrong here," he said eventually,
mostly to himself, tapping one gloved finger beside the disputed signature without quite touching the paper. Your genuine samples run consistently level across the full signature, barely a half degree of drift start to finish. This one climbs, starts level, rises about 2 degrees by the final letter. That's a tell. A forger copying a signature they're looking at tends to lose the baseline discipline toward the end, once they've stopped consciously tracing and started just finishing the motion. He shifted the loop lower, studying the tail of the final letter. And here the pen lift before the last stroke, yours never lifts there. Not once across 3 samples spanning 11 years. Whoever produced this lifted the pen, hesitated, and came back down at a slightly different angle. That's the kind of thing a man only does when he's uncertain of a shape he's copying, rather than certain of a shape he's simply always made. He moved to the second disputed contract, repeated the process, and made a small satisfied sound that told me before he had said a single further word exactly what conclusion he had already reached. Same drift, he said. Same climb. Both instruments produced by the same hand, and that hand was working from a photocopy rather than muscle memory, because muscle memory doesn't need to fight gravity like this. He set down the loop and looked at me directly for the first time since he had begun. Calvin, I've been comparing signatures in this office for 19 years. I want to say this plainly so there's no ambiguity in it later. This is not your signature, not on either document. Not one point of comparison matches not the baseline, not the pressure pattern, not the pen lifts between letters. Somebody copied the shape of your name. They did not copy you. The words landed the way words sometimes do, arriving fully formed and complete a half second before the weight of them actually reaches the part of a man that has to carry it. I had known this in every practical sense for weeks. I had told Guerrero, told Dawson, told myself in the dark more nights than I could count. Knowing a thing privately, in the careful architecture of your own suspicion, is an entirely different experience from watching a trained stranger lay it out under a lamp with instruments and measurements and 19 years of professional certainty behind every word. "Thank you, Leland," I said, and my voice held mostly the particular steadiness I had spent a lifetime building for exactly this kind of moment. "I'll get this documented properly and sent to Guerrero's office by end of day," Leland said, already reaching for a legal pad. "He'll have everything he needs to move this from dispute to fraud complaint. I'm sorry it took 2 forged pages and a man's whole reputation to get here, Calvin. You deserved better than that from the start." I thanked him again, gathered nothing since none of the documents were mine to carry out of that room, and walked out through the courthouse hallway and down the front steps into afternoon light that seemed absurdly exactly as ordinary as it had seemed walking in. I sat in my truck in the courthouse parking lot for a long while afterward. I did not start the engine. I did not reach for my phone to call Dawson or Guerrero, or anyone else who deserved to know what Leland had just confirmed. I sat with both hands in my lap, and after a moment I reached into my shirt pocket and took out my father's fountain pen. And I turned it over once, slowly, between my fingers, the worn lacquer catching the light the way it had caught light in a dozen kitchens across 3 generations of Pruitt hands. I did not cry. I want that recorded honestly the same way I have recorded everything else in this account, because I have not cried since the morning Luella died, and some part of me had quietly decided without ever discussing it with anyone that I did not intend to start now in a parking lot over a man who had married into this family and decided at some point I would likely never fully understand that my name was simply a tool available for his use. I sat there, instead turning the pen, watching a woman across the lot load groceries into her car, watching a flag on the courthouse pole move once, twice, in a breeze too faint to feel from where I sat. Somewhere behind me a car door shut, ordinary, unremarkable, and the sound of it landed strangely loud against the particular quiet I had built around myself. I thought, without meaning to, of Luella teaching me to tie a bowline knot in this exact parking lot 40 years ago, waiting on some permit or another, her hands over mine, patient, showing me the same loop 3 times before I finally kept it.
I let that memory sit there, beside everything else Leland had just confirmed. Not comparing the two, simply letting them occupy the same quiet space for however long they needed to. And I let the afternoon do whatever an afternoon needed to do to a man in that particular moment, without asking it to explain itself, and without asking anything of myself except to keep breathing steadily until I was ready to turn the key. Guerrero called 2 days later, and there was a different quality to his voice than I had heard from him before, the particular brisk energy of an attorney who has just watched a case move decisively in his client's favor. Leland's preliminary comparison, backed now by the county's formal examiner report, had confirmed everything Leland told me in that archive room, and Guerrero had used it in the time since to file a criminal fraud complaint alongside the existing civil challenge, a combination he described over the phone as considerably more persuasive to opposing counsel than either action would have been standing alone. "But that's not why I'm calling this morning," he said. "I want you in my office today if you can manage it. There's a piece of this we can close out completely right now, and I'd rather not wait another day to do it." I drove in that afternoon, and Guerrero met me at the door himself again, same as the first time, and led me back to his office, where a fresh stack of documents sat squared on the desk, considerably thicker than anything he had shown me before. "With the forgery confirmed," he said, sitting down across from me, "we're in a position to strengthen the trust well beyond what the original filing accomplished 4 years ago. I've drafted an amendment that explicitly forecloses any future claim against the mineral or timber rights held in Sonny's name, citing this fraud as grounds, which means even if Pierce were somehow to produce a third document tomorrow, notarized 6 ways from Sunday, it would have no legal pathway to reach that trust. Not through him. Not through Briley in a divorce proceeding, should it come to that. Not through anyone." He slid the amendment across the desk, and I read it the way I read everything, slowly, completely, and this time I did not find a single clause hiding anything from me. It was, as far as I could tell with my own working knowledge of these matters, exactly what it claimed to be, and precisely nothing more. "Where do I sign?" I asked. Guerrero turned to the final page and indicated the line with one finger. I reached into my shirt pocket for my father's pen, the same pen that had sat closed in my hand in a courthouse parking lot 2 days earlier. The same pen my grandfather had pressed into my father's palm at a graveside decades before either of us had been born. Into the particular trouble we now found ourselves navigating, and I signed my name. The way I had signed it my entire life. Level baseline, no drift, no hesitation. Nothing a careful man with a loop would ever have cause to question. Guerrero watched me cap the pen and set it down. "Nice pen," he said. "My father's," I said. "His father's before that." He nodded the particular respectful nod of a man who understood without needing further explanation that some objects in a person's life carry weight that has nothing to do with what they cost. He gathered the signed pages, initialed his own copy, and looked at me across the desk with an expression that had shifted subtly from professional focus into something closer to genuine satisfaction. "Calvin," he said, "this piece is done. Completely done. Whatever else happens with the criminal complaint, whatever happens between you and your son-in-law personally, Sonny's future on that land cannot be touched now. Not by Pierce. Not by anyone. I filed the amendment with the recorder's office on my way in this morning before you'd even arrived, because I wanted it locked in the moment you signed." Something in my chest loosened, not fully, not completely, but a real and measurable amount. The particular ease of watching a beam you have been worrying over for weeks finally get properly braced. "Thank you," I said. "Truly." "Don't thank me yet," he said, not unkindly capping his own pen. "The trust is secured. Your name is protected on paper now, beyond any reasonable dispute. But the man who did this to you is still your daughter's husband, still your grandson's father. And paper has never once in my 18 years of practicing law managed to fix what happens between people once the paper stops being the problem. That part's still ahead of you, whatever shape it ends up taking." I asked him before I left what came next on the criminal side. He told me the county prosecutor's office would review the fraud complaint within the next 2 weeks, that a forgery charge involving a document of this value would very likely proceed to formal charges rather than quietly dissolving into a warning or a fine, and that Pierce, whatever else was happening in his private life right now, was almost certainly already speaking with an attorney of his own about exactly that possibility. I asked whether Briley could be implicated in any of it. Guerrero shook his head slowly. "Nothing I've seen suggests she had any knowledge of the forgeries themselves," he said. "Whatever she knew about the trust correspondence, that's a separate matter entirely from forging a signature. I'd be surprised if her name appears anywhere in this beyond being married to the man who did it." I sat with that a moment, grateful for it, in a way that surprised me, given everything. Whatever came next for Pierce, I had never once wanted it to reach my daughter, or through her to Sonny, and hearing a careful, unsentimental attorney confirm that it likely would not, eased something in my chest I had not fully realized was still tight. I carried his words out of that office with me anyway, turned over already, weighed already sitting alongside the particular relief of a victory that had settled one entire category of fear while leaving another quieter one waiting patiently in the wings for its turn. I was not present for what happened next. I want to be honest about that from the start, the same way I have tried to be honest about everything else in this account. Because what follows reached me only afterward, in pieces, through 3 separate people who each held a different corner of it. And I have done my best since to fit those corners together into something close to the truth. Pierce had a standing relationship with Ridgeline Coal, the company whose envelope I had glimpsed in his truck bed on the morning this entire ordeal began. And their regional representative, a man named Archer Burns, had apparently been growing uneasy for weeks about the mineral rights deal once word of the legal challenge began circulating through the small, tightly connected world of county land transactions. What I learned later was that Pierce requested an in-person meeting at his own office on a Thursday afternoon, hoping, I can only assume, to salvage a deal that represented the difference between his construction business surviving the year and folding entirely under debt he had never once mentioned to anyone in this family until it was far too late to mention it usefully. Briley told me some of it. Guerrero's office, once the criminal complaint moved forward, filled in more from witness statements neither of us had access to before. And Margot inevitably arrived with the version already circulating through half the county by the time she brought it to my door. Pierce met Archer Burns at 2 in the afternoon, along with his office assistant, a young woman named Emerson, who had worked for him barely 6 months, and who would later tell investigators, according to what Guerrero eventually shared with me, that she had never seen her employer as unraveled as he appeared that day. Archer opened the meeting by explaining carefully that Ridgeline's legal department had flagged the transaction and would need written confirmation the underlying contract was clean before proceeding another step. He had brought a folder of his own, Briley told me later, thick with correspondence, and he set it on the table between them, the way a man sets down something he intends to use as leverage rather than simply reference. Pierce, by every account I have since gathered, did not handle that request well. He pushed first reasonably, then less reasonably, insisting the paperwork was solid, that this was simply his father-in-law causing trouble out of confusion and spite, a line he had apparently repeated to himself often enough by then that it came out of him almost automatically, worn smooth from overuse. Archer, unconvinced, pressed for specifics about the notarization, about the timeline, about a second document that had surfaced under circumstances he apparently found difficult to square with an honest transaction. Emerson told investigators the questions grew sharper each time Pierce failed to answer them cleanly, and that somewhere in the 4th or 5th exchange, she watched something in her employer's composure give way entirely, the particular collapse of a man who has been holding a structural weight too long without support and simply runs out of the strength required to keep holding it. And Pierce said something he could not take back. He said, according to Emerson's later statement, something close to it, "Doesn't matter how the signatures got there, the land is still worth what I said it's worth." And Archer, who had built a career on hearing exactly what a sentence like that actually confirmed, closed his folder without another word and left the office. Emerson did not leave quietly. Whatever she overheard in that room followed her out the door and into a phone call to a friend before the afternoon was finished. And from there, it moved the way news moves through a county this size, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily. One conversation passing it to the next conversation, until by supper time half the town understood, in broad, uneven strokes, that Pierce Kemp had said something in his own office that sounded very much like a confession. Briley told me she first heard it from her own supervisor at the hospital, a woman offering careful, sideways condolences before Briley had any idea there was something to be condoled about. I learned about it myself the following morning from Dawson, who had heard it at the diner from two separate customers before he had even finished his coffee. He did not editorialize when he told me. He simply set his mug down, looked at me steadily across the table, and said the whole thing had already left Pierce's hands the moment it left his mouth, and that neither of us was going to be able to do anything about where it traveled from here. I sat with that news for a long while after Dawson went out to open the shop, turning it over the way I turned over everything, slowly, from every angle. I had not orchestrated this. I want that understood plainly, because everything that follows in this account will ask you to believe I engineered my own vindication, and I did not. I had filed a legal challenge. I had asked a careful archivist to compare two signatures under a lamp. I had signed my name to a trust amendment with my father's pen. Not one of those actions had anything to do with what happened in Pierce's office that Thursday afternoon, and I found I could hold that fact steadily without either taking false credit for it or pretending it did not matter to me at all that the truth, once it started moving on its own, had apparently decided it no longer needed my permission to keep moving. I learned what happened between Briley and Pierce that Thursday evening because Briley told me herself 2 days later, sitting across from me in Dawson's back room with her hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa she never once drank from. She had aged in the way grief ages a person overnight rather than gradually. Faint shadows under her eyes that had not been there the last time I had seen her up close. Her hair pulled back with less care than I had ever known her to allow herself in public. I am going to tell it the way she told it to me, in her own order, because I think she deserves that much accuracy after everything else that had already been said about our family by people who were not actually in the room for any of it. She heard the first version from her hospital supervisor. Careful and sideways, the kind of concern that tells you something serious before it tells you what the something actually is. She heard a fuller version an hour later from a neighbor who called under the thin pretense of asking about a casserole dish. By the time Pierce came home that evening, Briley was standing in the kitchen with dinner going cold on the stove, and a question in her chest she had been rehearsing for 2 solid hours. Is it true she asked him before he had even set down his keys? What people are saying you said to Archer Burns. She told me his face did something she had never seen it do before, not during their wedding, not during either difficult birth, not during any argument in 15 years of marriage. It simply stopped performing. Whatever careful arrangement Pierce kept his features in for the rest of the world fell away entirely, and what was underneath it, she said, looked exhausted in a way that frightened her more than anger would have. The company's failing dad, he told her. He had never once used those exact words with her before, not in 3 years of what she had assumed reasonably was a business merely tightening its belt, the way most small construction outfits do in a slow season. Not tightening, failing. A commercial project outside Beckley had collapsed the year before when the anchor tenant backed out mid-build, and Pierce had personally guaranteed the construction loan against it, the way a man does when he believes in the moment that his own confidence is collateral enough against the world going wrong. $800,000, Briley said, still owed on equipment and materials for a building that now sat half-finished on a lot nobody wanted, weeds already working up through the poured foundation. The bank set a deadline, Briley told me. The loan matures in November. If he can't cover it by then, they call the whole balance due at once, and he loses the company, the equipment, probably the house too, depending on how the guarantee was structured. November, I said. Their anniversary. Briley nodded, and something moved across her face that I recognized immediately because I had felt its exact shape myself more than once these past weeks. The particular sick clarity of understanding a piece of timing you had never once thought to question. He needed the mineral rights money finalized before then, she said, before our anniversary, so the loan would already be covered, so I wouldn't find out about any of it until it was already handled, already fixed, already something he could frame as a story about smart planning instead of a story about desperation. He told me he thought he had time to make it right before I ever needed to know it had gone wrong. "And the forgery?" I asked gently, as I knew how to ask something that was not gentle at all. "He didn't answer that part directly," she said. "He just kept saying he never meant for it to go this far. That he thought once the money came through, everything would sort itself out, and nobody would ever need to look closely at how it started. As though the ending could somehow excuse the beginning, if only the ending arrived fast enough." I sat with that for a moment, turning it the way I turned everything, and found I could not entirely disagree with the shape of the thinking, even while I rejected every part of where it had led him. A frightened man convinces himself of stranger arithmetic than that every single day. It rarely spares the people standing closest to him. Briley set down her cocoa, still untouched, and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on my daughter's face since she was very young. The particular, stripped-down honesty of someone who has stopped performing composure because performing it has simply become too expensive to keep affording. "I told him I needed time," she said. "I told him I couldn't look at him the same way tonight that I looked at him this morning, and that I didn't know yet what that meant for us, only that it meant something, and that he didn't get to decide what." She had sat alone in that kitchen afterward for a long while. Dinner cold on the stove, working through piece by piece exactly how much of the last several months she needed to re-examine in light of what she now understood. And somewhere in that reckoning, she told me she had decided that whatever came next between her and Pierce, her father, deserved to hear the truth from her directly, rather than filtered again through gossip or lawyers or a 10-year-old boy carrying more of this family's secrets than any child should ever be asked to carry. So she had picked up her phone and she had called me. Briley did not leave when she finished telling me about the loan and the deadline. She sat a while longer, turning her cold cocoa in slow circles on the table. And something in the set of her shoulders told me, the way a father learns to read these things without needing them announced, that she had come to Dawson's carrying more than she had set down so far. "There's something else," she said finally. "Something he told me that night after the part about the bank. I don't know if it changes anything. I don't know if it's supposed to, but I keep thinking about it, and I thought you should know it too." "Go on," I said. "You know that little piece of dried earth he carries in his wallet," she said, "behind his license wrapped in a scrap of plastic? I asked him about it once, years ago, early on, and he told me it was nothing, just something from home, and I let it go. Because that's what you do with a man who clearly doesn't want the question pursued. I saw it again maybe a dozen times over the years whenever his wallet came open on the kitchen counter, and I stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing anything familiar enough. It never once occurred to me to wonder why a grown man keeps dirt in his wallet like some kind of charm. I did not know about it," I told her honestly. I had never once seen inside Pierce's wallet in 15 years of knowing him. "He told me the whole thing that night," she said. "His father owned a small farm outside Man, over in Logan County. 3 generations of it before Pierce was even born. When Pierce was 12, a coal company came through buying up mineral rights across that whole hollow, and his father wouldn't sell. Held out for almost 2 years, while every neighbor around him took the money and got out. Then a bad harvest hit the same year. An old debt came due, a debt his father had taken out against the farm itself years before, back when debt still felt like an ordinary tool rather than a trap closing slowly. The bank called it. The coal company, who'd been waiting the whole time, bought the note from the bank for pennies, and inside of 2 months, Pierce's family was off that land for good. He watched his father pack a truck in a single afternoon, load it with whatever fit, and leave the rest for whoever came next. He was 12 years old, standing in a yard that had belonged to his family for 3 generations, watching it stop belonging to anyone he loved in the space of one long day. I sat with that a long moment, the particular stillness I had learned to hold when a piece of information arrives too large to respond to immediately with anything smaller than silence. "That's where the dirt came from," Briley said. "He went back once years later, before we were even married, and he took a handful from what used to be the edge of their pasture, and he's carried some of it with him every single day since. And he told me that night that he's spent his whole adult life terrified of standing exactly where his father stood, and that somewhere along the way, without ever quite deciding to, he convinced himself the only way to avoid it was to make sure he was never the one left holding an unpaid debt when the bank came calling. So he did to you exactly what was done to his own father," I said, and the sentence arrived. Flat, factual, because I did not yet trust myself to layer anything else on top of it. "I don't think he saw it that way while he was doing it," Briley said. "I think he saw it as making sure it could never happen to him again. I don't think he ever once let himself notice that the shape of what he was protecting himself from was the exact shape of what he was doing to you." I did not tell Briley sitting there that I recognized something in that account beyond simple explanation. I did not say that a man who watches his father lose everything to quiet, patient legal maneuvering sometimes grows into a man who trusts nothing that cannot be seized quickly before someone else seizes it first, and that this particular kind of fear, left untreated long enough, does not stay contained to the person who first felt it, but reaches forward into whatever family he eventually builds of his own. I did not say any of that aloud. Some understanding once reached belongs more usefully inside a man than spoken across a table, and I had learned across 69 years of watching people carry their private histories that naming another person's wound out loud rarely helps them carry it more lightly. I only reached across the table and covered Briley's hand with mine, the way I used to when she was small and frightened of something ordinary, a thunderstorm, a dark hallway, the particular helplessness of being young and unable to fix a thing that frightened you. "It doesn't excuse what he did," I said. "Nothing excuses forging a man's name. But I understand now, a little better than I did this morning, why a person might convince himself it was the only door left open to him." Briley nodded, and neither of us said anything further for a while, and the quiet between us held something neither triumph nor forgiveness, only the particular heaviness of two people trying to hold at the same time both the truth of what Pierce had done and the truth of what had made him capable of doing it. Pierce came to the garage himself 4 days later, on a Thursday evening, which told me something before he had said a single word, since Pierce had never once in 15 years made an important decision on a Thursday. Believing, without ever quite articulating it, that weekends belong to family, and weekdays belong to problems best kept separate from it. The fact that he was standing in Dawson's gravel lot on a Thursday evening in his work clothes, unshaven in a way that read as neglect rather than intention, told me plainly enough that whoever had sent him here, if anyone had it, was not a calculation anymore. It was simply a man who had run out of other places to be. I opened the door before he reached it. "Dad," he said, "can I come in?" "Of course," I said, and stepped back. He came in and looked around the small room the way people look at a space when they are searching for the right thing to say about it and failing to find one. I watched him take in the narrow bed, the dresser, Luella's photograph on the wall where I had hung it the first week, and something moved across his face he tried to cover quickly with a careful, practiced expression that did not quite hold. "It's small," he said, and then immediately, "I don't mean that as, are you comfortable here? Do you need anything?" "I have what I need," I said. "Sit down, Pierce." He sat in the wooden chair across from the small table. I sat on the edge of the bed. We were perhaps 6 feet apart, which felt in that moment like exactly the right distance for the conversation we were about to have. Close enough to hear each other clearly. Far enough that neither of us could pretend the distance between us had already closed on its own. He looked at his hands for a long moment before he looked at me. "I know what I did," he said. "I know Briley already told you, and I know Guerrero's office already has the whole thing documented, and I'm not here to explain it away or ask you to sign anything else. I just needed to say it to your face. I forged your signature. Twice. I planted a fake contract in your own truck. I stood up in front of the whole town and let people believe you were losing your mind, and the entire time I knew from the very first night that you hadn't taken a single thing that wasn't already yours to give or keep. His voice broke somewhere in the middle of that, and he pressed one fist against his mouth, and I watched my son-in-law weep in a way I had genuinely never once seen from him. Not the managed, self-conscious kind of crying a man does when he wants to be seen crying, but the ugly, uncontrolled kind that arrives from somewhere a person cannot fully govern. I stood in the center of my small room and let him. My own chest ached with a grief I did not have easy words left for watching a man I had once taught to check the oil in a truck engine on a cold Saturday morning come apart in a chair across from me. "I know about your father," I said once his breathing had slowed enough to hear me. "About the farm. About what happened to you when you were 12. Pierce looked up at that something raw moving across his face. "That doesn't excuse it," I said. "I want you to hear that clearly, because I think some part of you is hoping it might. It doesn't. A 12-year-old boy watching his family lose everything is a wound. What you did to me, to Sonny's future, to your own marriage was a choice made by a grown man who had other doors available to him and chose this one anyway. Both things are true at once. I need you to understand I can hold both without letting either one cancel the other out." "I know," he said, barely above a whisper. "I know that now. I didn't let myself know it while I was doing it." I looked at him steadily, and I thought not for the first time these past weeks about a summer, decades gone, about a brother and a fence line, and a version of myself who had once chosen quiet over correct, and told himself for years afterward that quiet was simply the more mature road to take. I had believed for most of my life that keeping the peace mattered more than being right, that a family held together by careful silence was worth more than a family occasionally cracked open by honesty. I did not believe that any longer. I had learned at considerable cost that the two were never actually opposites to begin with. Only two things that looked like opposites to a man who had never once tried holding on to both at the same time. "I forgive you," I said, "as your father-in-law, completely and without condition. That part is finished. But I am not coming back to that house, Pierce. Not because I am still angry, though some of that will take longer to settle than I can promise you today. Because some things once broken, the particular way we broke this, do not return to exactly what they were before, and pretending otherwise would only be another kind of dishonesty. And I have had enough of those to last the rest of whatever years I have left." Pierce pressed both hands over his eyes. "Then, what do I do?" he asked, his voice cracking on the last word. "You start over," I said. "Honestly this time. That's all. That's enough." The old homestead cabin had stood empty on the northern corner of the property for as long as I could remember the original one-room structure my great-great-grandfather built before anyone thought to build anything grander, kept standing out of family sentiment more than practical use. A place we stored tools and old furniture, and for one memorable summer, when Sonny was 6, an entire family of barn swallows. Nobody had the heart to evict before the nesting season finished properly. Guerrero had helped me work out in the weeks since Pierce's confession, a clean legal arrangement carving that particular corner of the land cabin and the half-acre around it into something held plainly and separately in my own name, agreed to without argument by either Briley or Pierce, who both understood, I think, that some form of restitution was owed, and this was a form neither of them found difficult to grant. I spent 6 weeks fixing it properly most days, working alone from first light until my knees told me plainly enough that the day was finished, whether I agreed with them or not. New roof, rewired for actual electricity instead of the single questionable outlet that had served it since the 1970s, a wood stove for the coming winter, shelving built along one whole wall for the survey equipment, and reference books I had accumulated across 4 decades of work I intended to keep doing. Differently now, on my own terms, for whoever in this county needed a careful set of eyes on a piece of paper before they trusted it with their name. Blake came out 2 Saturdays in a row to help with the wiring, refusing payment both times, saying only that a man who once taught him to read a survey map for free had earned the right to be helped without an invoice attached to it. Margot brought soup twice, standing in the doorway, critiquing my shelf spacing, with the same unhesitating authority she had once brought to a fourth-grade classroom. Dawson helped me hang the sign on a cold, bright morning in December, 4 days before Christmas. He held the level while I drove the screws, stepped back, tilted his head with the particular critical squint he brought to any piece of finished work, and said the 2 words that from Dawson Grant constituted a full and enthusiastic review. "Looks right. Pruitt Land Services," the sign read, hand-painted by a sign maker 2 counties over, who had done work for the county recorder's office for years, and understood exactly the kind of clean, unfussy lettering the job called for. Land surveying, signature verification, estate documentation. Underneath, smaller, a line I had insisted on, despite the sign maker's general suggestion that it read as unusual for a business sign. 30 years reading what people put their name to, I still do. I stood back and looked at it for a long while after Dawson went inside to check on the wood stove he had insisted on testing personally before certifying it fit for use. The morning was cold and clear, the particular sharp blue sky cold of an Appalachian December that makes every sound carry farther than it should. And somewhere down the ridge, I could hear faintly the sound of a truck slowing on the gravel road, and then a car door and then the specific, unmistakable rhythm of a 10-year-old boy running full speed toward something he had decided before he even reached it was going to be the best thing he had seen all week. Grandpa Sonny shouted, still 30 yards off, backpack bouncing against his shoulders the way it always did, breath fogging visibly in the cold air. "Is that your office? Is that actually your office now?" "It is," I said, and something loosened in my chest, warm and complete, watching him close the last of that distance at a dead run. He arrived, breathless, skidded slightly on the frosted gravel, and threw both arms around my waist with enough force that I had to plant my feet to keep us both upright. I held on to him, the particular solid warmth of a child who has run the whole way there simply because running felt truer to how he was feeling than walking would have. "This is the coolest thing I have ever seen in my entire life," he announced, pulling back to take in the cabin. The new roof, the sign, the smoke already beginning to curl from the stovepipe where Dawson had gotten the fire going. "Can I see inside? Can I help? I want to learn how you tell if a signature is real." "Come in out of the cold first," I told him, laughing. A real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind I had not managed easily in months. And I held the door while he pushed past me into the warm, sawdust-smelling room, already peppering me with questions about the loop he had spotted on the workbench, about whether he could have his own magnifying glass, about whether Tuesday afternoons might work for lessons, since that was the day his homework load ran lightest. Whoever dropped him off had not come to the door, and the empty gravel road behind him told its own quiet story. Briley had chosen to give him this particular joy, to carry into the cabin entirely on his own, unwatched, uncomplicated by any adult's need to witness it happening. I appreciated that more than I said aloud. Some gifts land better without an audience. Dawson stuck his head out the cabin door, wiping his hands on a rag, and surveyed the 2 of us standing there in the cold, Sonny already tugging at my sleeve toward the workbench. "Fire's going, Bob," he said. "Coffee's on too if either one of you plans on coming inside sometime this morning, instead of standing out here catching your death." We went in together, Sonny's hand finding mine the same way it always had, and the door swung shut behind us, on a small, warm room that smelled of wood smoke and fresh-cut pine, holding for the first time in months nothing I needed to explain, defend, or carry alone. Sonny sat on the tall stool at my new workbench that first afternoon, elbows planted, chin nearly level with the surface, a mug of cocoa cooling forgotten beside him, because for once, something had captured his full attention more completely than a snack could compete with, and studied the 2 signatures I had set in front of him with the particular ferocious concentration he brought to anything he had decided mattered. "This one," I said, tapping the first page, "is genuine. Written by the same hand every single time for 30 years. This one is a careful copy made by somebody looking at the first one and trying to reproduce it exactly. Tell me what you see." He bent low over the pages, nose nearly touching the paper the way I had taught him not to do, and the way he did anyway, every single time. Turning the practice loop I had bought him that very morning slowly over each line, murmuring to himself the way I had noticed he did when he was thinking hardest. After a long, serious silence, he pointed at the second signature with one finger. "This one's shakier here," he said, "at the end, like the hand got tired holding the shape steady." "That's exactly right," I told him. And something in my chest swelled with a pride that had nothing to do with land or money or anything either of us could have put a dollar figure to. A copy always tires near the end, buddy. The real thing never does, because the real thing was never work in the first place. It was just how a man's hand naturally moves. He absorbed that the way he absorbed everything, filing it away somewhere behind those serious brown eyes for later use. And then he looked up at me with an entirely different expression, more careful, more deliberate. "Grandpa," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Always," I said. "That pen you keep in your pocket, the old one, is that the one you told me about from your dad and his dad?" I reached into my shirt pocket and drew it out, the black lacquer-worn pail along the barrel from 3 generations of Pruitt hands, gripping it the same particular way. And I set it in my open palm between us, letting the low afternoon light through the window catch what remained of its shine. "It is," I said. "My grandfather gave it to my father at a graveside the day my father buried his own dad. My father gave it to me the same way years later, at another graveside, with almost no words attached to the giving because some things don't need words to carry their whole meaning intact." Sonny looked at the pen with the particular reverence he reserved for objects he understood correctly to be older and more important than himself. "I want you to have it," I said. His head came up fast. "Really, not to keep in your backpack and lose behind the couch cushions," I said, and he laughed, a bright, startled sound that filled the small room. "I'll keep it safe here at the office until you're old enough to carry it the way it deserves to be carried. But it's yours now. Whenever you sign something that matters for the rest of your life, I want it to be with this pen, so that whatever hand ends up holding it, it stays exactly the kind of hand that never needs to shake near the end of a signature." Sonny reached out and touched the barrel once, gently, with the particular careful reverence of a boy who understood without needing it fully explained that he had just been handed something considerably larger than an object. "I promise," he said, "I won't lose it, and I'll learn everything you know, about signatures, about the land, all of it." "I know you will," I said, and I believed it completely. The particular clean certainty of a man who has spent a great many years learning to trust his own read of another person's character, and who had, across one very long autumn, relearned exactly how much that instinct could cost him, and how much it could still be worth keeping anyway. It was later that afternoon, after Sonny had gone back to practicing his loop technique on a stack of practice documents I had assembled specifically for that purpose, muttering measurements to himself the exact way he had watched Leland do it, that I glanced toward the window and noticed a truck parked at the far end of the gravel drive, engine idling, exhaust curling white into the cold air. Pierce sat behind the wheel, not approaching, not honking, not doing anything to announce himself, beyond simply being visible from where I stood. I did not wave him in. I did not walk out to send him away either. I only stood there a moment, one hand resting on the workbench beside the pages Sonny had been studying, watching my son-in-law watch his son through a window from a distance he had chosen for himself. And I let that particular quiet stretch exactly as long as it needed to, without deciding yet what it meant or what it might eventually become. Only that it was for now precisely where the two of us had honestly landed. The truck sat there perhaps 5 minutes before it pulled away, slow, careful, the way a man drives when he is not entirely certain he wants to be leaving. Sonny never looked up from his loop. I did not tell him his father had been there. Some things a boy learns to carry more easily if he is allowed to learn them on his own schedule, in his own time, rather than handed to him second-hand by a grandfather still working out how to carry the same weight himself. The pen sits in a small wooden case on the shelf behind my workbench now, waiting for a hand not quite ready yet to carry it every day. Some mornings, the light through the east window finds that case exactly right, and for just a moment the old lacquer looks new again, the way inherited things sometimes do if you catch them at the correct angle, in the correct light, patiently waiting their turn. I spent most of my life believing that keeping the peace mattered more than being right, that a family held together by careful silence was worth more than a family occasionally cracked open by honesty. I was wrong about that, though it took me 69 years and considerable cost to finally understand it clearly. Being right and keeping the peace were never actually opposites. They only looked that way to a man who had never once tried holding on to both at the same time. Somewhere between a forged signature and a boy's honest question, I learned that protecting the truth is not the opposite of loving your family. Sometimes it is the only honest way left to do it. If you have been where I have been, giving your patience to people who mistook it for permission, I hope you hear this plainly. Do not wait as long as I did. I thank God for the friends who believed me before the proof arrived, for the grandson whose honesty never once wavered, and for what I choose to believe was God's own timing and how the truth finally stood up on its own, even when I was too tired to keep standing it up myself. God does not always move quickly. In my experience, though, He moves completely. If you were me, would you have signed that paper just to make the trouble stop? Or would you have driven to that county office before the sun came up the way I did? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I suspect the answer says something true about each of us. If this story found you today, share it with someone who needs to hear that patience and surrender are not the same thing. And if you believe truth still matters in this world, however long it takes to arrive, stay with me,
Because the next story is